Adhikari, who is a columnist and author from Nepal, who's just written a very interesting book, which unfortunately isn't available here, on the Maoist insurgency. Ahmed, who has also written a very interesting book, which also isn't available here, unfortunately. And Cyril Almeida, who's a columnist for the Dawn in Karachi, and on authority on many things in Pakistan and South Asia. Let me begin, and my name is Samar Halarkar. Let me we'll talk a bit about what this session is supposed to be. It was, I think, supposed to be a session on South Asia and I think India's role in it, but we're not going to do exactly that. This is all very boring to talk of India and the big bully in the room, etc., which India is, of course. But apart from that, what we're going to do is we're going to look back at the time just before the British left, when there was one undivided map, and people and ideas and cultures flowed freely across what are now borders. And what I'm going to request all our panelists to do is take a crack at imagining a world where those borders don't exist, but only the political borders exist and everything else is open to a free flow of information, culture, etc. So we're just trying to imagine what it could be if the South Asian area was somewhat like ASEAN or perhaps the North American free trade area. So let me begin by starting with Anis. And I have to say that there's a lot of expertise that these gentlemen bring in. For example, we were talking earlier, and Anis was talking about some of the, not just the similarities, but the exchanges that are happening anyway between Bangladesh and the Bengali-speaking areas of India. And there's lots I never knew about earlier. So we'll begin with him, and then we'll take it on to the other people.
Thank you, Samar. Without planning or discussing, we've all four managed to come up on stage dressed mostly in blue. I think basically we're looking for a lot more natural synchrony of this kind in the region. And that is what we would see more of if the borders were open to a reasonable degree. You can have the political borders for political reasons. But if you had basically free flow of people, goods, and ideas, and the various media which carry ideas, then I think we would have a very different kind of landscape. And what's interesting, or what's I think ironic, is that the borders have become so rigid in this supposedly globalized or post-globalized era, when so many other borders are opening up, and many in our countries sometimes enjoy a certain ease of exchange with countries that are not in this region, that are farther away. But among ourselves, the borders have actually stayed quite rigid, in cases become more so, and almost always from a point of national security worries. If these borders were open, I think those worries themselves would actually be addressed in ways that are hard to quantify or predict what it would happen. Some of the things I imagine would happen if these borders were open to that degree right now is that across the field, we would actually see better cultural products because the competition would force that. Right now you can have bad Bangladeshi movies that are subsidized with government funds and that are at some level sort of rather poor mimicry of Bollywood films. And I think those films would die the natural death they deserve to die. But it would also force some of the better filmmakers and producers then to come up with either a better or a different kind of fare for which there would be an audience. And sometimes, subsidized culture gets lazy and no one's exploring it. And that's just one example. But also there are very good cultural products in Bangladesh that just doesn't make it over here enough. And that can lead to very, strong misperceptions. For example, there's a very strong secular tradition in Bangladesh. I would actually, and this may be shocking to many Indians, I would go so far as to argue that at this moment, Bangladesh is possibly the most secular country in the region. Many Indians I know don't have that impression at all, because many of them, even in Bangla or in translation, the only book they have encountered is Tasmanastrin's Lodja, which depicts a dysfunction of a very particular moment that was made possible by a very particular force that is now very much on the retreat. But the greater reality of what has put them in retreat and the literature and culture that captures that, that has not found a way due to various restrictions, including non-tariff barriers. And if we didn't have this kind of this perception on both sides, if there was more communication, more understanding, I think the culture would be richer. I'll just leave it at that for now. I'm sure we'll, as we go around, have chances to bring out more.
We were also talking about fish earlier. The thing is, you know, the few I don't know too much about Bengali fish eating habits, but I do know that many Bengalis, especially those who came over from that side of the border, always say that the ilish from there is much superior to the type we get here. And there were other friends of ours from Los Angeles who said that, well, we get it in Los Angeles, but we don't get it in Calcutta. So those are the kind of things also that could easily freely, if ilish could cross borders freely, I imagine we might make a good beginning. Cyril, we were talking earlier also of the possibility of things that might happen. For example, breakfast in Lahore, lunch in Patna, dinner in Dhaka, a train perhaps that runs through, etc. But taking that, using that as a metaphor, try to imagine a few other things that might happen, apart from Veena Malik.
Apart from Veena Malik. Thanks, Samar. I mean, I think when it comes to India and Pakistan specifically, and of course, you talk about trying to avoid Big Brother syndrome or not wanting to talk about that. But I think largely in this context, it is about selling the argument to India itself that there's something in opening up to Pakistan too, in terms of trade, economically, politically, trying to sort of engage the country more. We know all that everything that Pakistan has and continues to be doing when it comes to security policy as dictated by our army. But I think this, my sense in my travels around India over several years, is that Indians now seem to consider that they're too big to really care about Pakistan. We're still small fish. Economically speaking, our economy is about $300 billion, formal economy. Trade between India and Pakistan is roughly about $3 to $4 billion, largely because it's not allowed. It has to go through Dubai and Singapore. But even if it were to expand, the estimates are perhaps up to maybe 7 or 8 billion 5 years later. And those are really sort of the numbers don't really add up compared to what, for example, the trade between India and China, or that India and the US and the Western markets are doing. So there is that element of trying to sell it to India that what's in it for them. And I think normalcy or normality is a possibility that will only come about through engagement, frankly. And I'm not talking about political. I mean, Anish just mentioned about movies and how there's been a revival of Pakistani cinema in the last 2 or 3 years. And it's largely because of some of the factors that Anish was mentioning, which is Bollywood movies which had sort of unofficially been banned in cinemas in Pakistan for over a decade or a decade and a half, were allowed back in. So then you have this flourishing of these, upper middle class in the malls, sort of cineplexes with multi-screens, and you can go and you can buy a 600 rupee ticket with about $5 or $8, and you can get popcorn. And that has sort of revived interest in going to cinemas again. But what brought the people in initially was Bollywood, because they all want to go, rather than watch it at home on a bootleg copy on your cable or on your sort of DVD player, you can watch it in the cinema. And that has now created an impetus for Pakistani filmmakers, because there's a market, there's a cinema-going market once again that has been in decline. So there are these kind of different things that may seem indirect, sort of they have spillover effects. And I think a lot of the conversation when it comes to India talking about Pakistan is just like, well, there's nothing really that they have to offer us other than stop on the D word, the terrorism word, right? But I think that sort of misses the point in a large way, which is that kind of other all-round engagement creates linkages and has these unexpected sort of effects that, frankly, these are complex societies, these are complex economies, these are old, settled civilizations and cultures, maybe even a monoculture perhaps at a pop level. But sort of the understanding that going forward, if you open the doors, then strange things may happen in positive ways. And you can't predict it beforehand. I mean, I can tell you that our Commerce Ministry estimates that if, for example, a free trade agreement were to be signed and non-tariff barriers that you mentioned, were to be brought down, X number of dollars more worth of trade would be done by Pakistani companies, etc. But those are things that you're talking about bureaucrats dreaming up these schemes. Whereas it's actually about if you allow the people to be able to interact with each other, do business with each other directly, they'll figure out how to and where and some opportunity. And what's happening right now is a rather statist view of things. And I think perhaps if we switch, I'm not saying it's possible in this environment, but what I'm trying to say is that trying to imagine the possibilities is actually a hopeless game for me, because it's just such a complex, vibrant thing on both sides, that there are going to be all sorts of unexpected things. But really the point is to try and convince both sides that it's in their interest to do this. And I'm not sure anymore that perhaps that when India looks at Pakistan, it sees it as an opportunity. It largely sees it and perceives it as a threat. And in that environment, and again, making no bones about what Pakistan's security policy or the army support with India has been over the decades, but as long as that continues or grows, and I feel like as India becomes stronger, bigger, I mean, I've been traveling here for about 10 years, and I've seen the infrastructure get transformed in this country. The airports, the roads, the malls, I mean, this consumer-led sort of, I don't want to call it a revolution, but boom, is evident. And it seems like perhaps India might consider or start to think that, well, we've left Pakistan so far behind that there's no real point to it anymore. And I'm sorry, I mean, I understood earlier we were talking about this, not trying to talk about the worst thing. And again, I mean, we could talk about security policy, we could talk about all this thing. My point really is just that if, and I'll stop with this, if you allow or you were to envisage what is possible between these two people, but just remove the barriers, you see all sorts of unexpected sort of collaborations happen. And we can talk about whether electricity surplus can be sold to Pakistan. We can talk about, well, your textile dyes, whether they can be bought, those kind of things. But it's really at the people to people level that we don't even know the possibilities yet, because they've never really been allowed to interact.
Yeah, but that works on, of course, both ways, because I mean, Pakistan also has not allowed this most favored nation. So that works on both sides.
Sure.
So
no, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form, but we know that this is what one side can do, the other side can do worse, and that seems to be the unfortunate dynamic of the relationship.
Yes.
And I'm in no way trying to suggest that well, this is like an Indian problem. What I'm trying to say is that as India grows and it succeeds and it becomes economically prosperous, it seems like the argument for engaging Pakistan is diminishing. And that to me is a worrying thing, given that the problem of the relationship will continue.
But I have to say, when you talk about infrastructure, things changing here, anyone who goes to Pakistan always comes away saying that, why can't we have expressways like that?
Sure, but that's the motorway between Islamabad and Lahore. And it's actually a white elephant. It can't pay for itself, because most of the commercial traffic and the trucking industry goes down the GT road, because it's much cheaper and it's shorter. The motorway was built 120 kilometers longer than the GT road because of political patronage and reasons like that.
Aditya, coming over to Nepal, things are a little more complex there, because there are already quite a few linkages, both official and unofficial. We even have Gurkha regiments in the Indian Army which still recruit from Nepal, and a lot of other people are streaming across the border lots of times. Yet there is this great tension that comes up now because of China on the other side and India on the other side. How do you see that relationship emerging?
Well, I'm an anomaly on this panel because Nepal is the only country here which was not part of undivided India after 1947, and Nepal is the only country among Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. Among our three countries, Nepal is the only country which is, after 1947, has been very deeply integrated into India. Kind of almost like, it's, the borders are so porous, and kind of family linkages across borders are very intense. When I come to India, it's barely, I hardly even feel like I'm getting into another country. It's so easy, right? And these linkages exist for most Nepalis. Having said this, I see there are major benefits for kind of having integration with India. I mean, there is a very strong nationalist stream in Nepal which wants, greater autonomy. Psychologically, they feel that this kind of breeds a kind of dependence upon India, which they find somewhat intolerable. But I think, and other people think that it's a very beneficial relationship. Now, having said that, I think there's for a long time. I mean, there's the idea of SAARC, there's the idea of creating a South Asian identity. I'm a bit skeptical of this actually. I mean, yes, it's all well and good, like kind of travel across borders, create a regional culture, but it's not easy to create that. And first of all, okay, so Bangladesh and Pakistan, I mean, each small country in South Asia, they're only interested in India. They're hardly interested in anything else. I mean, India. I mean, you call India the bully in the room. I mean, okay, politically sometimes this is a bully in the room, but it's a great hegemon. It's a very large power. And for every other country in the region, India is kind of, when they say South Asia, in their mind, India figures, right? I mean, the other countries, yes, okay, there is a kind of affection deep down perhaps, but for each, when you think of another South Asian country, it's probably quite, it's likely that India will figure somehow in the equation. I remember in the 1990s, in Nepal has had some relations with Pakistan diplomatically. Okay, what can we do to kind of, marginalize India, or Bangladesh? What can we do to come together and kind of, cut India down to size? I mean, that's political. But even culturally, I remember in the mid-1990s, and a lot of my friends, I don't watch cricket, but a lot of my friends who did, they cheered Pakistan just because, Pakistan was kind of against India. I mean, that was, so I mean, that doesn't happen. I mean, as far as I know, I mean, that anti-Indian sentiment is declined. The other thing is, yes, I mean, you can talk about kind of movements between people and exchange of ideas and kind of like cultural linkages and all this kind of stuff. And these do happen. I mean, this is an example of it. There are many kind of vernacular exchanges like film festivals, etc. But at the same time, I mean, power relations is a major thing also. I mean, I feel, and here too, again, India is the hegemon. Like Bollywood is so big for all the kind of, even for us, like people who are writers, the Indian publishing industry is kind of where we want to get published. The Indian publishing industry is dominant, and I think that, in a way, I mean, this is, I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, greater integration, I mean, what it often does, it kind of, empowers the big things that exist already. I mean, I think greater integration would mean that Bollywood becomes even more dependent and marginalizes local art forms, in my opinion. I mean, and also it leads to a greater homogenization. I mean, I feel that we should really celebrate kind of regionalism at the expense, because, I mean, this kind of, like we speak in English, like I'm traveling here, we're talking about regionalization, and we're coming together. I mean, like the elites of all our countries are coming together on a platform. But at the same time, I mean, vernaculars are kind of, this is damaging to vernaculars. And vernaculars, there is connection too. I mean, and also it's not just a question about cross-border kind of integration. I mean, okay, so where vernaculars meet, they can enrich each other. But the problem is, it's not just that we're different countries. I mean, the problems are within India also are similar, I find, from one state to another, with their diverse languages. Lastly, I mean, there is this idea of South Asia. I mean, in Nepal, it's a concept, and there are kind of, people around, who kind of want to create a common identity. And I kind of sympathize with this. I vastly prefer this group of people to, let's say, kind of national security types, who are kind of like, in India, you have a kind of type of person who says that we don't want to. This is not South Asia. This is the Indian subcontinent. This is like, we are dominant here. We should call it the Indian subcontinent. I mean, I certainly don't identify with those tendencies in Indian society. I still kind of feel that South Asia is a kind of a good concept, and I do kind of have a fondness kind of towards, and I do recognize the culture in Pakistan or Bangladesh as kind of being similar to mine in many ways. But at the same time, I mean, I think this idea of South Asia, it's difficult to find a definition of it, which is secular. I mean, all the people who propagate the idea of South Asia are secular, and But what is the concept? I mean, like, what are the civilizational links? How is it different from the idea of Bharatvarsha, which comes from the Hindutva conception, which is not something that we want presumably. So I mean, I think the category itself is underdefined and vague.
So that's very interesting. So I think all my three speakers have actually said that, I don't think we really want close integration with the elephant in the room, so to say. And there is some, does make a lot of sense, certainly from their point of view, in the sense that if you were to talk about preserving cultures, ways of life, etc., with increased travel, with increased communications, closeness, that probably might not happen, and a greater homogenization is definitely possible. So am I right in assuming that all of you are very cautious about this and say we would rather not have this integration across South Asia?
No, that wasn't my position.
Mine did not.
I think, sorry, yeah, the problem is exactly this, which is even in Pakistan, it's sort of like a hub and spokes kind of model, really, because everyone who talks about South Asia is really talking about the interaction with India as opposed to with each other. For example, Pakistan and Bangladesh, whether it's the largest textile, exporting country, maybe not the world, but like a large chunk of their exports come from that, as do Pakistan exports. And on top of that, a number of professional managers from Pakistan over the years have migrated to Bangladesh to run a number of companies or manage their factories in Bangladesh because they've had the expertise in Pakistan for decades. But even that is something which is not talked about in those two countries, right? If you ask your average Pakistani who reads the newspaper, is he aware that there are like perhaps thousands, if not more, Pakistanis working in Bangladesh who migrated there to take up these jobs as managers of companies, textile exporting? No one actually knows.
I didn't know about that.
And vice versa. So it's strange that the integration that and it goes back to my point earlier when I was trying to say that the kind of integration that will happen in ways that we can't necessarily envisage. Right? We may not have understood, perhaps even 20 years ago, that because of Bangladesh's lower labor rates, or perhaps its growing industry out there, that they would suddenly shoot up in the textile exporting states internationally. And as they did, that created an incentive for Pakistani professionals to go across to Bangladesh and help them grow the industry out there. Now you would think, in Pakistan you'd be aware of that. The Pakistanis might be worried, well, why is our premier exporting products, sort of the professional management, being drawn to another country as opposed to doing it inside Pakistan? But there's no actual conversation about that. And I think, so to me, like South Asia is largely this kind of hub and spokes, and the disruption is between Pakistan and India, because they both consider themselves too big to really let the other one dominate, right? And beyond that, the language of interaction doesn't concern the other countries. Like Pakistan is not really thinking about, well, what can it do with Nepal, other than that Nepal is an easy way to get into India, right? For various things that have happened over the decades. So the thinking itself seems to, at least to me, sitting in Pakistan, about India, maybe not the hegemon, but India, the hub, and everyone, all these countries around are trying to engage with Pakistan, unwilling to sort of exceed the superior role of this other country, so wanting to be at par, whereas everyone else, not really, to my mind, looking to interact or engage with each other, even if these small pockets happen.
India is definitely the hegemon, and for India, the smaller countries can either be an opportunity or a threat, and sometimes both. Now, no matter which is your advantage and what you see, one thing I personally feel very strongly about, and I have several sort of trends I've watched over the last 2 decades that have made me think this way. Engagement is always the better option. If, for example, I'm looking at it from the Bangladesh point of view, if we think of India as the hegemon, trying to, quote, hide from it or ignore it or bury our face in the silt, we don't have sand, and it's not going to be the most effective way of dealing with a hegemon. Like whatever the worries of that are, you're not going to address it better by trying to ignore it or avoid it. You're still going to address it better by engaging with it. conversely, if India is looking at Bangladesh as an opportunity, be it for security alliance, be it for better trade, be it even like one of the big worries in India about, say, Bangladesh is migrating to India, even for that, yeah, barbed wire is good up to a point. But engagement of a different kind and a broader kind may offer better solutions, and models of that exist around the world. And one thing I've always felt is that if you look at two of the best regional models of regionalism politically in the world, EU and ASEAN, one thing they have in common is that the larger powers were equitable powers. And almost everywhere where it hasn't happened, say in North America, say in Russia-centric Central Asia or other places, it is because one power is way too big. And that does create this hub and spoke model. And I think one of the challenges for the international order is not to say that, oh, we have a hub and spoke model. So what should be a model of regionalism for the hub and spoke model? I think we're reaching a point where we need to think about that. And I think one of the first things that needs to happen is for both the big country and the small country, contrary to what people think, I think actually we've all been suffering from the same syndrome, and not surprisingly, because we've all been, in a global perspective, new countries. Up to the 70s, 80s, India was in a sense a new country, and it had a very defensive mentality. And Bangladesh too went through a very defensive mentality up through the 80s and 90s. In just the last few years, I feel that all our countries, some of our countries are starting, and our populations are starting to come out of that defensive mentality, which is why, as of just last month, you've had India and Bangladesh truly talking about solving 4 decades old land border disputes. And I don't think it is only a matter of electoral outcomes and who's in power. Certainly that has been crucial or critical to it, but also there is actually sufficient receptivity in both populations for solutions of that kind. And you will have those solutions if there is more discussion. One of the big issues for the region is going to be climate, and a big component of that is going to be water. You're not going to have effective water management without cross-border engagement. So this is going to affect us deeply, and if my earlier comments weren't clear on that, I see nothing but good coming out of greater engagement. There's a kind of engagement which depends on policies taken by states in matters of political interaction, diplomacy, allowing people, goods, and ideas to move, etc. And there is also a degree within whatever scope that exists where people can have more engagement themselves, and they're the better for it. And I'll finish with a small example of that. There is one space where we already have that open border, and that's social media. And I've been watching it very carefully for the last few years, and it's amazing. Whenever there's a discussion about India on Facebook, if there's a thread where there's no Indians present, I can see Bangladesh is getting strident in a way that changes the minute there is a comment from an India. As long as you're dealing with another person and they get humanized, the tone and tenor of conversation almost always changes. So by keeping our borders high, we are needlessly, I wouldn't say dehumanizing us or one another, but we are putting up barriers that are not advancing any solutions.
I think that's a fine example. We've been talking of a lot of hypothetical stuff that could happen, might happen, etc. But you're completely right. I never thought of that. The social media is one area where these borders have dropped. I mean, certainly when I'm on social media, I follow so many people in Bangladesh, in Nepal, and in Pakistan, and it's almost like it's a very clear, easy engagement, and it's almost like it's been accepted now. So it feels part of this of the same territory, so to say. And certainly between Pakistan and India, this goes on, I think, pretty often, and they've got to know people on social media, etc., who you perhaps might not know otherwise. What do you think?
Social media has definitely been very useful to me to kind of follow what's happening in culture in India and Pakistan, and to a certain extent in Bangladesh also. But to return to something you were saying earlier, I mean, of course, I am for deeper integration. What I was against is just a kind of the vague notion of kind of South Asian regionalism, which hasn't led to anything, and which kind of is platitudinous and kind of prevents, I think, for further kind of thought on how to make proper integration happen. I want to connect this to what you were saying about China also. I mean, there are fears in India now that particularly Nepal and Sri Lanka, Bangladesh to a certain extent, I guess, are getting closer to China. The Chinese are coming into these countries in a big way, and this is kind of undermining the Indian sphere of influence, and undermining Indian national security. And this is in Indian foreign policy calculations, this is almost the most dominant kind of view to take when looking at India and Sri Lanka, Nepal and Sri Lanka. But I mean, from Nepal, I mean, I can't say about what it looks like from Sri Lanka, but from Nepal, it seems that this fear is kind of absurd. It's a bit absurd, because Indians are just so influential anyway. They've been just so influential over many decades. And yes, I mean, politically they are still almost completely dominant. Culturally, yes, there have been other influences, to the west, and there are greater Chinese coming in, kind of engaging in economic activity. There's a lot of foreign aid, so you have a lot of foreign aid missions. So culturally and kind of economically, it's not completely beholden to India. But it still doesn't really feel like that there's any major threat to Indian national security, at least where we're from. And I think this Indian fear, which is also a kind of defensive mentality, I think has worked against promoting greater regionalism. While looking at Bangladesh or while looking at Sri Lanka, when the Indian state says, okay, someone else is going to come here, we got to guard our sphere and not let other people come in. And so we're just going to deal with this country individually and kind of, just like us and them and like no one else, and just through the sphere of national security. It prevents greater cooperation, primarily economically. Now, I mean, now there are ideas that there should be greater economic cooperation, if not through all the 7 members of SAARC, at least through a couple of countries, maybe Nepal, India, and Bangladesh, or maybe, I mean, who knows, like someday, kind of China, Nepal, and India. But I mean, I think there's this mentality needs to be overcome for that to happen.
We could go on, but I think we have very little time left, so we open it up for questions. If anyone has a question, yes.
I have one brief comment and one question. Comments on China, if India can have billions of dollars of trade with China, and if India can seek Chinese capital for bullet trains, I mean, it has very little moral right to tell the neighbors not to engage with China. So I think that argument really gets undermined, and they will have to live with the inevitability of Chinese role growing. But my question is something else. What we saw in SAARC a few weeks ago, last week, was a new regional doctrine that seems to be developing in India. And we can see that under this new government, they are interested in South Asia, and they are interested in connectivity and integration, but they seem to be keen to take the bilateral route. So instead of the regional route, they will deepen engagement with different countries in the region, but they will do it bilaterally. And when you speak to officials, they are pretty candid in saying, we will create a South Asia where we will hive off Pakistan. We are not interested in Pakistan, I think Cyril is right there, but we will deepen our engagement with other countries. Is that feasible? And what are the consequences of India adopting a bilateral approach to deepen engagement with different countries? Anybody?
I don't think it's feasible, but I'll let them take a crack.
I think that's true that it's not, it's largely what India looking for bilateral sort of engagement with different countries in the region as opposed to SAARC, of course, the platform that exists. I think it's unfortunately the reality is that the India-Pakistan equation scuttles everything at a regional level, and that's just the reality of it, because whether it's the bloody mindedness of Pakistani officials or the stubbornness of the Indian official government, etc., that kind of cooperation, SAARC as it was envisaged, and what kind of possibilities that were there, just cannot go forward because of that dynamic between India and Pakistan. And until that changes, which essentially goes back to saying, hey, let's figure out the bilateral stuff first before we can talk about the regional stuff. I mean, it's sort of, you go around in circles. And I don't really see much potential for it. What I do think could happen in the meantime is if the other countries of the region, of South Asia, were to sort of ramp up the importance that they give countries other than India in the region. Sort of of whether it's trade or cultural exchanges or sort of political interactions, etc. Even that doesn't seem to happen. So in the absence of the Pakistan-India equation really sort of, which I don't think anyone's hopeful it will be sorted out anytime soon, the possibility for me is rather the other countries in the region, other than India, looking for further engagement with each other. So that if and when we ever get to that stage where Pakistan and India can sort their problems out, then you'll be ready to be able to capitalize on the possibilities there. But short of that, I mean, it might sound bleak, but I don't see it happening.
Yes.
Maybe you want to
I'm a freelance journalist, and I was just wondering, is there any role, because all of you are journalists in some sense of the term, and writers too, so do you think that there is any chance that the media from different countries and the quote-unquote South Asian consciousness can come together to do something for this kind of an integration? Because at the end of the day, when we talk about people-to-people contact, we actually talk about cultural, intellectual kind of an engagement rather than political handshakes here and there. I also speak this because in the recently concluded general elections here in the country, we saw a huge role of media and social media being manipulated, all kinds of things happened. So do you see media playing a constructive role somewhere in the regional sense of the term?
I'll let the other two answer, but I'll just, a short little snippet that might explain. Do you know the number of Indian journalists in Pakistan at the moment? 0. The number of Pakistani journalists in India, 0. And officially, there's an exchange program, well, effectively, that 2 journalists from India are permitted to come to Pakistan, one of the Hindu and one with Press Trust of India, and in Pakistan, vice versa, with both state media. This is an official practice that prevents journalists from being able to work and live and report from these 2 countries that are fundamental, perhaps, to their politics and their, their security, but no access. So, what they can do within their own countries is really much less than what they could do, perhaps, if they were able to work. But
But there are journalists who write for publications.
Sure, there is that kind of interaction, but exactly what I'm saying is like just that idea that journalists are not allowed to work and live and report on the neighboring country, actually not permitted to. I mean, you can write about it. I write about Indian, sort of Pakistani foreign policy and national security policy, etc. But the idea is that you don't actually have an on-the-ground presence in most countries. Don has a reporter, a full-time reporter in India, but he's Indian, right? He's not a Pakistani citizen. So sort of like in the absence of that, everything else is a little sort of lower.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think journalism could contribute to major. I mean, there is a very big lack of understanding between countries in South Asia. I think, and you could say Nepal and India too. And among other reasons why it's valuable, I can just say that, the lack of information in India, particularly about countries in the region, allows the government and the state to take kind of secretive policies towards these countries, which Indians have absolutely no idea about, and which the Indian public could possibly be opposed to. And if the nature of the politics of other South Asian countries and the Indian role of what the Indians are actually doing there was kind of more broadly broadcast, it would probably have a substantial degree of influence in Indian foreign policy.
I just want to say that, right now, ANI, which is Asia News International in Delhi, which has now become de facto one of the largest suppliers of video news to channels across India with the withering away of television news bureaus. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and the editor took me to a room where she does a special program for a couple of Bangladeshi television channels every day, a roundup of what's happening in India. So I asked her, is there a demand here saying, can you source something from there? She said, no, not at all. So they want to know, but we are not interested in what goes on here. So you had a question? So we'll take one final question here. You can take 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that unless the problems between India and Pakistan are solved, SAARC cannot make big headway. And I also agree that India as a hegemonic power is viewed almost like a big brother in many of the SAARC countries, which I have visited, including Pakistan, Nepal. I haven't been to Bangladesh, Bhutan, and so on, Sri Lanka. So the question to ask is, why is that in the case of the European Union, such a huge breakthrough was made over the period of since the Second World War, and they also got the Nobel Prize for Peace and so on. And this kind of integration, not only of the markets, but of the culture of the people, by opening of the borders. And before that, for hundreds of years or more, these countries were waging war against each other. Germany against France, against each other. And the enmity was much worse than between India and Pakistan, which is for a much shorter time. So why is it that we are not able to create a European Union? And there, can I just finish? And there the problem is that India, as the gentleman from Bangladesh said, that in Europe there are two powers who are equal. And it's true that in case of South Asia, India is much more powerful. But by the same token, India has a greater responsibility to share that power, to be more generous. And if India and Pakistan can behave like Germany and France, Germany contributes a lot to the European Community Fund, other economies are going down. France preserves its culture, its films, and so on, from competition from Hollywood and so on. And if we follow these policies in South Asia, maybe could make an advancement.
But also about sharing the resources.
China is also important here,
Because many of
the rivers.
Question.
Can you give him a...
Yes.
Talk for that.
Sure. From my understanding of the situation, it's not only a matter of India being by a significant margin, the largest nation in terms of size, but more importantly, population, and also economic might. There are other particular unique conditions that prevail here. For example, India is the only country that actually has a border with all of us. Bangladesh doesn't have a border with Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka. And that sheer lack of physical access creates a certain kind of situation that did not obtain in Europe or in Southeast Asia. You know, multiple countries having access to multiple other countries automatically creates a certain kind of leverage. If you're not giving me access, if you're not being fair, I have other options. Over here, I think it was Aditya who was saying that, or Cyril too, that we should be looking at each other. We can be looking at each other, but sometimes that's all we can do. We can look at each other. We can't actually access each other. So that's one problem. Another problem is, if most of the world were run by people with your kind of mindset, sir, then the world would be a much better place. But those in power, the first word that comes to their mind is not sharing. So it comes down to realpolitik. And I don't want to single out India as particularly or uniquely, quote, bad or anything at all. India is doing exactly what is natural for a country in its position to be doing. And I do see a certain kind of what I previously called a defensive mindset, which prevail both in India and in our side of the border and the other countries. And there's a certain easing of that on all sides. But despite that, it comes down to realpolitik, and that means if both parties or multiple parties have even some comparison of leverage, then you're going to get to a deal. In the absence of that, it's hard. So in Europe, what happened is the EU didn't come out of what my co-panelists have termed a vague, gauzy notion of a cultural shared spiritedness. It came out of something extremely prosaic, a deal on coal and iron. Because coal and iron in the 60s, coal and iron were critical to making war, even in the 60s. Now I think it's mainly video games. But back then, if the coal and iron treaties were strongly maintained, it kind of acted as a leverage and prevented these countries from going to war. And then the economic integration. Their economic interests became so enmeshed that peace prevailed and led to greater integration on other levels. So what we have to think of here is that it is not just a generalized model of hub and spoke, but this particular unique model of hub and spoke with India. What do these countries even individually have to offer India? And India, from that new non-defensive position, trying to recognize what might it gain from greater opening up with each of these countries rather than from a defensive position. Also, a final point about what makes these relationships so unequal is that in most cases, or in significant cases, India is the upper riparian country, especially with Bangladesh. So if you ask me, like, what might then be the way out for us, I don't dare give a solution in about 45 seconds, which Vivek is threatening. But I think the solution may lie in these countries, the other countries. What has created a certain balance, what modicum of balance we have, say in the case of Bangladesh, has come from two things. Bangladesh's ability to propel itself forward socially and economically, even when things were much more closed up with India, because the world is open. And Bangladesh is having a certain kind of security partnership and access to China and Russia. And that has led to India finally recognizing that Bangladesh is not only dependent on us, rather if we keep shunning Bangladesh, we will be pushing it closer into the arms of China. Better give it some love and keep it on our side. And that's what's starting to happen in recent years. So the other countries have to come up. Bangladesh has an advantage over Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka in that it's populous, it's sizable. Because of our population size, we have $200 billion income now, and we have significant trade with India. But in all these cases, other forms of leverage can be found to be used constructively.
Thank you so much. I know that was a wonderful panel. It's hard to stop. Please pay attention to these gentlemen. Cyril Almeida from Pakistan, Ahmed from Bangladesh, Aditya Adhikari from Nepal, and Goa's own Samar Halarkar. I know you were privy to a most wonderful discussion here.